the nature and extent of juvenile delinquency and victimization. So, how much delinquency is happening and who is doing it? One way that we can answer that question is checking out arrest rates of juveniles. We know that about 700,000 juveniles are arrested every year. And so when we actually unpack those arrests, we see that arrests for property crimes occur much more often than arrests for violent crimes. In 2019, juveniles accounted for 18% of arrests for property crime versus about 7% of arrests for violent crime. And over half of all arrests for Part 1 offenses are for larceny and theft. Aggravated assault and robbery are the most common arrests for violent crimes, yet juveniles who are arrested for violent crime, they really only count about 2% of violent crime arrests for homicide. The most common arrests for Part 2 offenses are these lower-level status crimes, so simple assault, drug abuse, being disorderly, vandalism, spray painting, tagging, underage drinking, curfew violations, and running away. But we also have to keep in mind where the data is coming from. So arrest data is helpful for us to understand the nature and extent of juvenile delinquency, but remember that arrest data is really only about half of the story. Arrest data only represents crimes that have come to the attention of the police, and actually most crimes don't come to the attention of police. Only about 40% of all victimizations are actually reported to the police. And even if officers are aware of crimes, they're not always able to catch the offender unless they discover them on scene or they have, someone to identify them or the offenders leave evidence. And officers also have discretion of whether or not they are going to let a youth go or make them arrest. And we know from arrest data that officers tend to make arrests for much more serious offenses. So in all, arrest data vastly underestimates the extent of delinquency, especially minor delinquency, and arrest data can also be fleeting in estimating trends in delinquency. It doesn't always account for every factor that could increase or decrease victimization. Victims are most likely to report certain crimes in certain areas. Another option to look at the nature and extent of juvenile delinquency is self-report data. So the government spends a ton of money so that we can be able to collect nationally representative samples of juveniles. And so data sources like Monitoring the Future, the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, these are all surveys or interviews of youth where they're able to self-report crimes. Unlike arrest data, which is really only half of the story, this type of data collection allows for youth to be able to report crimes that they've committed, that they have and have not been caught for. However, where are we going to find teens? Schools. Does every teen enjoy school? Absolutely not. And that's why we have issues with truancies. The ones who are actually skipping school, we may not be able to tap into those because a lot of these surveys are done, regular kind of high schools or middle schools. However, teens don't always want to tell strangers about the crimes that they committed. They don't know if, I'm going to take their survey and turn them into the police. And then also teens love to brag about stuff. So sometimes you have to be careful with survey data. It also may not tap into serious delinquency because the youth that are responsible for the highest rates of delinquency may not always be present when surveys are being distributed. It's also underrepresentative of homeless youth who are detained in treatment centers or are attending alternative schools or boarding schools. Those who are in traditional high schools are probably the ones who are engaging in lower rates of delinquency rather than, Thad Jarvis who skips class and smells like cigarettes, who just so happened to be shockingly absent on the day of the survey. So we have to be careful. But nevertheless, self-report data shows us some really interesting information about the nature and extent of delinquency. So this data comes from Monitoring the Future, which collects a nationally representative sample of high school seniors. It really kind of focuses on different types of risk behaviors and delinquency. And what it shows is in the blue, that is the percentage of teens who have never engaged in those behaviors. The gray blue is they've done it once or twice in 2014, and the green is they've done it 3 or more times. And so what we see is, certain forms of delinquency are much more common, particularly these status offenses and minor forms of delinquency. So like fighting with their parents, I cannot believe 15% of teens have never fought with their parents, but I guess it also depends on how they define fun. But, shoplifting, taking things out, without permission. And from the green, major delinquency is much less common. So when we look at arrests compared to self-report data, what this shows is that the majority of delinquent acts don't always come to the attention of police, which means that arrest data are going to dramatically underestimate the nature and extent of delinquency. But what we know from self-report data and reliable sources is that really about almost all juveniles engage in some forms of delinquency. It's really only about 10% of youth who do not engage in delinquency during adolescence. Of all youth, only about 5 to 15% of them are what we call these high-risk offenders, the ones that are committing the majority of the offenses and are most likely to continue offending in adulthood. What we know from the research about juveniles ages 10 to 17 also commit on average about 52 delinquent acts per year. And most of these are going to be status offenses or minor crimes like fighting with your parents, shoplifting, underage drinking, using drugs, smoking marijuana, stealing stop signs. When we look at self-report data versus arrest data, most delinquent acts are not going to come to the attention of the police. That is important to keep in mind. There are certain benefits to using arrest data, but when we want to look at, the most accurate estimates of the nature and extent of delinquency and victimization, it's better to go with studies of self-reported behavior.